Hey there. I want to talk today about the extraordinary value of finding and choosing mentors, which are two different activities, by the way. Finding mentors, how does that happen? What qualifies, so to speak, somebody as a mentor? Why would you want to find them anyway? And then once you've found them, what does it mean to choose them as a mentor? And what can you get out of that? I also want to talk a little bit about all the sources, if you will, for where a person can find mentors. Because often it's seen as somebody that has to be personal, like they're a personal teacher, for example, and then they became, your mentor. So I want to talk about that. One thing I want to sort of put out there is that there's no such thing as choosing proteges. So a person doesn't go out into society and walk up to somebody and say, "You are now my protege," and you just sort of announce that, and now they're your protege. They have to choose you as a mentor. I'll be doing a video podcast on that concept as well, on becoming chosen as a mentor. But right now I'm talking about being a protege by your own work, by your own choosing, by the exercising of your own agency to become a protege, to choose mentors. So 40 years ago tomorrow, my father passed away. I was 15 years old. And I had sort of a distant relationship with my father, because he had a distant relationship with everybody, it seemed to me. He was quite busy, always gone, always working, always engaged in other things. And I didn't feel like I knew him all that well. Due to an accident and then complications, he passed away. And I remember thinking, wow, to get to know my father better, that would have been kind of cool. And I walked into his closet, and on the shelf of his closet, about head high, he had a series of books, and they were just these aesthetically pleasing row of 10 books between these stone weights. And they all matched, and they were all in a series. It was called the Mental Efficiency Series. And I thought, oh my gosh, if my dad read all of these, if I read them, then that'll be sort of me getting to know my dad a little bit. And I saw a spot where he had put a little marker in the pages, and I recognized his writing. I could see that he had written a little bit in the margins of about 3 pages of one of the books. So I read that first, and about those 3 pages and a couple pages more is all it took for me to become enthralled in what this person that had written these pages had to say. I grew up in a small town, and for me, as a 15-year-old in a little town, I hadn't really identified mentors. I hadn't really even thought much about that. I'd gone to seminary, and so I'd read, the Bible and a few things, and what we traditionally think of, people who are examples in history, like Jesus Christ, for example. I am a believer in that as well, and was back then, and so you could say that I had familiarized myself with people as mentors. But a little closer to home, or a little bit more kind of on this planet, I hadn't yet. And so it was interesting to discover who some of these people were. So one of the authors of 3 or 4 of the volumes of this series that was published in 1915, called the Mental Efficiency Series, one of the guys who was one of the writers was a man by the name of Yorimoto Tashi. And he was a statesman and a shogun in the 12th century in Japan. And he wrote about influence and how to exert it, and common sense, and timidity, and how to not be a timid person. And I was just blown away by some of the exercises that he wrote down for people to do, like breathing exercises and focusing your eyes on different things, and how you physically use your eyes. These were exercises that he had come up with from all the way back then. How to be a statesman, how to be influential. And I was 15 years old. I had never heard of these types of things, and I was just enthralled. And I read I read that whole series, and had discovered during the process my dad had read about 2 pages or 3. And by that time, though, my original goal of getting to know my dad better had gone away, and it was more of, who are these people and these concepts they're trying to help other people understand. I want to understand those concepts. And so without sort of knowing it, I chose this man, Yorimoto Tashi, as a mentor. And I read those books multiple times. I walked around with them in my pocket at school. Another author that was one of the authors of this same series, his name is Xanthes, I think is how you pronounce it. He's a Greek philosopher. And that was amazing as well. I think his subject was about speech. So, again, being in a little town, northern Arizona, kind of isolated. There wasn't bookstores. There was the library, and I went to the library. That's not the greatest source for nonfiction philosophy books back then. So I remember, after I sort of had read this series of books a handful of times, I can't remember who I was with, but anyway, we traveled down to Phoenix Mesa area where there was a bookstore. And I remember going to the philosophy section, which was kind of small back in those days. I remember it actually was 2 rows. It was wide enough for 2 books per sort of shelf, this like vertical row of philosophy books. And I had enough money to buy 2 books. And I totally was judging books by their cover. I had no idea how else to go about this. But I looked down and I saw a book called Pulling Your Own Strings. And I thought that was interesting. Pulling Your Own Strings. Okay. Wayne Dyer. I had no idea who Wayne Dyer was. I'm like, oh, okay, I'll get that one. Pulling Your Own Strings. And then next to it was this really cool Chinese character, heavy ink brush style character. And the title of the book was The Way of Life. And then in smaller text by Lao Tzu. Way of Life. Okay, Way of Life. That sounds interesting. I grabbed that one. I had no idea that I had grabbed the second of a long series of books that will be written by Dr. Wayne Dyer. And I had no idea who Lao Tzu was, nor what the Tao Te Ching was, nor what Taoism was, nor what Zen Buddhism was, all of which was a journey I was getting ready to go on, starting with this The Way of Life book. And the translator of that one, or transductor actually of that one, was a man by the name of Witter Bynner. So I wandered around with these 2 books. I read that translation of the Tao Te Ching, The Way of Life by Witter Bynner, several times. And while I was reading it, I came to understand that there were a lot of translations of the Tao Te Ching from Chinese into English. So during my sophomore year of high school, I actually bought 6 or 7 more translations of the Tao Te Ching, and I made this comparative study. I wanted to understand what Lao Tzu was trying to say. So a philosopher that lived back in 600 BC, contemporaneously with Confucius. And Confucius actually was very complimentary of Lao Tzu, considered him sort of a sagacious person even compared to himself. Anyway, without knowing it, I had chosen Lao Tzu to be my mentor. Well, and while reading that, I read about the things that Confucius had to say about Lao Tzu. And so I bought the Analects of Confucius, and now Confucius was my mentor. Then during the process, I found an author by the name of Leo Buscaglia. I was watching a PBS show, and back in those days, PBS was one of the channels, one of the few channels on TV, and it had long periods of the fundraising. You know, in my 16-year-old brain, there was like 3 hours of fundraising, and then the show, whatever the show was. But this guy, Leo Buscaglia, he would talk with his arms and his hands like this, and describe just cool stuff about appreciating other people and love and kindness and family. And it seemed to fill a hole for me that I didn't know, that I had not yet understood that there was an emptiness for. So sometimes we don't understand that we have emptiness, and unless we take an effort to go track down mentors, we don't know if that emptiness can be filled. And sometimes when we find a mentor and find knowledge and find an example, we both discover that we had an emptiness and that it's being filled at the same time. And so I read everything that Leo Buscaglia had to write at the time. One of those books he wrote was called The Way of the Bull, and I remember having essentially an anxiety attack during high school, and I left and I spent the whole day just sitting in the forest from sun up to sundown, literally the sun going down right as I was finishing that book, The Way of the Bull by Leo Buscaglia. So Leo Buscaglia had become my mentor, and I remember when he died, I wept. People you choose for mentors don't have to know you even chose them. In fact, most of us are mentors if we've been a teacher, an instructor, or a parent, or somebody who is older than somebody else who's around some younger person for almost any length of time. We get chosen as mentors and we don't know it. That's one of the reasons to watch ourselves, because we're being observed all the time. And you never know, somebody may have chosen you as a mentor along the way. What kind of mentor were you? What kind of mentor will you be? What kind of mentor are you right now? And if you're a good chooser of mentors, finder of mentors and chooser of mentors, then almost by default, you might become an inspirational mentor to somebody that you don't even know chose you. And in effect, that person has chosen the mentors that you chose without knowing it. For example, Wayne Dyer, in one of his books, he was talking about being invited to be on a panel to speak somewhere in Europe, having to do with, I believe the subject was gratitude, like amongst humanity. And in the book, he wrote about going into the venue and kind of looking around where he'd be sitting at this table where there would be a panel of 6 or 7 people. And the way he wrote it, he goes, I saw the name tag of the person that I'd be sitting next to, and my heart sunk. And I felt in my heart and soul, who am I to sit next to this man? In effect, he was talking about his unworthiness to sit next to some man. And I was like, oh my gosh, who is Wayne Dyer talking about here? That was so intimidating to him and was clearly a mentor of his. Intimidating in a starstruck kind of way is how I gathered how he wrote this. And so he said, then when people starting to fill their seats and the panel was sitting down at the table, I found myself walking to the table and sitting down next to Viktor Frankl. So then I wondered, who is this? Who is Viktor Frankl? So I was a senior in high school, and I went and bought this book written by Viktor Frankl called The Man's Search for Meaning. During Christmas vacation of my senior year, in the morning of a given day, it may have been like the day after Christmas, I don't remember exactly, but it was in the morning, I made a goal to read it that day. So I sat down in my bedroom, and at the end of the day, when I was shutting that book, I couldn't stop crying. And during reading the book too, I couldn't stop crying. And then I contemplated logotherapy, and there's a book called Man's Unheard Cry for Meaning, which I believe was Viktor Frankl's second book. I read that. And then I tried to find out a little bit more about logotherapy. This was pre-internet days, so that was kind of hard. But I had chosen now Viktor Frankl as a mentor, and he had long since left this earth, and he had been Wayne Dyer's mentor, and Wayne Dyer, without knowing, had been my mentor. So again, there may be somebody, if anybody has been watching me and has chosen me for a mentor, for example, without knowing it, they chose Viktor Frankl and Wayne Dyer and Leo Buscaglia and Yorimoto Tashi, for example. Somebody, it was a high school teacher, gave me this volume that had the writings of the meditations of Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, and Socrates. And I read that a few times as well. So again, without really purposely, this day I shall choose Marcus Aurelius as my mentor. It's not really how it works. It's just sort of a automated thing. You can reflect back and understand that you chose this person as a mentor. I chose them as mentors. Then I read Jonathan Livingston Seagull and a couple other books by that same author. I chose him as a mentor. Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Zen in the Art of Zen in the Martial Arts, Zen in the Art of Archery. The authors of those books and the aspects of Zen that they had taught themselves became my mentors. So I began now to have Zen Buddhism as a general philosophy be something that was mentoring me. If you see the Buddha on the side of the road, kill him. Good book, funny title, meaningful once you kind of get into it and understand why the title is like that. I read that one. And then I remember going to a university as a senior, or maybe as a junior, to see whether or not that was it's like the recruiting efforts. And I went there to go through the whole recruitment process or whatever. And I went to the bookstore and bought The History of Chinese Philosophy, volumes 1 and 2. I had no idea it was a textbook for like college courses, but I bought this because I was so interested in what I had discovered about Zen Buddhism, which was, Buddhism as it flowed up into China and became influenced by Taoism, now became Zen Buddhism. And then that went across China and became its own style of Buddhism. And I was just fascinated by all of that. So I figured, the history of Chinese philosophy would give me more information on that. And it did. And so that was great. Then during that process, I read the Dancing Wu Li Masters and the Tao of Physics, which is books about the coming together of Eastern philosophy and modern Western physics. So all of these people were now mentors of mine. And this is in addition to, by the way, having a couple actual physical mentors, high school teachers that were very helpful to me in my life. And they know to this day, one of them has passed on, but they both know and knew that they were my mentors, that I had chosen them as mentors, because I told them later in life. And I thanked them for being who they were and for helping me without. One of them wasn't even trying to directly be super helpful to me, but he just saw me as a person and treated me as more than just a kid. And the other one went out of his way to try to help this kid whose father had died a couple years earlier. And see if maybe he could help him out in his life. And so these two guys were my mentors as well. And I have appreciation for the actual persons that have mentored me. And I also have appreciation for all of these people from the 12th century to a few years ago, through the 6th century BC, actually. The time frame doesn't matter if they left footprints of their influence. When a person leaves footprints of their influence, typically in written form, other people can pick them up. Later in my life, in my career, I learned how to track animals, track people, that kind of thing, especially in wilderness type places. And people leave signals of where they've been. And we can become good trackers if we want to. So a couple things about finding mentors, a couple more things about finding mentors, choosing mentors. Keep in mind that people aren't perfect. Viktor Frankl wasn't perfect. Wayne Dyer. People are just people. And there may come a day where you find some piece of information about somebody that's like disappointing or whatever, and you're like, oh, that person never should have been I should have never thought of them as a mentor type person. That's one danger. Another danger is, oh my gosh, this person is just glorious and they're my mentor. And I don't even care if they did A, B, C, D, E, and F and all of these horrible things. They're still the most amazing person. You don't have to go either one of those directions, either heroify or romanticize how amazing they were, or dismiss them because they weren't perfect. Take information that you can assimilate into your own heart from where you might learn it from people. And then let it now become yours. Because once you adopt what you have learned from a mentor, that information or that way of being or that wisdom that you picked up, once yours, is not attributable to them anymore. It's yours. And so now you are the one that can pass that on. You are the one who has that. The mentor, well, here's a concept in Taoism. The best mentor is the one who the protege barely even remembers ever existed, because they allowed that student, that protege, to absorb it, own it, and then move on with it. They don't need to exist anymore. So the flip side of that is, once you've learned it, you own it, you have embedded a certain principle in your life that you can attribute to having sort of some experience with a mentorship relationship that you've learned. Let it be yours now. And then you don't have to have somebody that was either had to be perfect or is going to be defined as perfect regardless of whether they are or aren't. And you're more solid on your own footing because you're embodying this information now. To leave credit at the feet of mentors diminishes yourself at some point. There's a man who I have a lot of respect for, and I asked him once about one of his leaders, and he was very, almost crushingly clear on this point. Somebody might have been helpful in your life, but you stand on your own 2 feet, Gallagher. So, okay, all right, I hear you. And I believe that to be a true principle. So, when you choose mentors, let the principles that you feel like you're learning soak into you, and then let yourself become. And as you continue to become that person that you're developing and becoming is just simply you now. How cool is that? And anybody who's a real mentor won't mind that they don't get any credit for that. So, the value of mentors. Thanks.